or the rest of Africa as far as that goes. So this is a bit of an intellectual journey for students here. It might be kind of interesting to see how old academics get well beyond midlife crisis, like it's almost, last quarter of the life crisis. And how some of these ideas about thinking about Africa and the rest of the world come to be. So I'm not sure this is an intellectual journey or a dead end. And you'll see it's come up sort of serendipitously that I've started to think about magical realism. And if there are any literature scholars here who know a lot more about magical realism than I do, I would really like to get your feedback. I think I started out in university taking some really good courses in Commonwealth literature with Doug Killam at the University of Guelph, and he had taught Ngugi wa Thiong'o and many of those, and knew Soyinka very, very well. And, I would have really, I think, liked to have been an English scholar, except my father said, you'll never get a job doing something like that, do something practical. And journalism too. Journalism, you just end up being a drunk. So here we are, being an academic, sort of talking away about how to think. This is perhaps where it should have started, from Karl Marx to Antonio Gramsci, but it didn't. It started out with Gramsci and went to Karl Marx. When I was doing my MA and PhD, Gramsci was pretty popular, but I'm sort of thinking now, maybe that's too soft, that's too cultural, that's too superstructural. And if I started with the good old orthodox Karl Marx, base determined superstructural economic determinism, the material life is what really counts, I might have had an easier job getting out of this cul-de-sac. And again, of course, it's always, you always worry being kind of a almost approaching death white male talking about politics in other parts of the world. So one's always a little bit worried about being politically incorrect, about being too satirical, about being too cynical. But I think, and also about being too teleological, because if you get into Karl Marx, you get much too teleological. History goes in these stages: primitive communalism, to feudalism, to capitalism, to socialism, to communism, etc., etc. So you can get caught in that sort of trap, but you can also get caught into a trap of everything is unique, and cultural relativism, and postmodernism, wherever you want to go. But I think, if we go back to the old Marx, we do see a pretty severe and violent and tumultuous and brutal process of primitive accumulation that happens in every society as capital emerges from pre-capitalist social relations of production. Blood comes dripping with every pore out of that process. There's no real reason why we should think it should be different in any society which is in a form of transition. And that transition can take a very, very long time. Indeed, in Europe, the heartland of capitalism, if you go and look at Marx on primitive accumulation, he talks about centuries, but he always flips, and he turns centuries into almost milliseconds, right? So he's always jumping back and forth from a very sort of longue durée historical type of thing to flashpoints and revolutions. And of course, the first time primitive accumulation happened in the world, it was pretty tragic. The enclosures, the transformation of peasants into the proletariat, that whole process is tragic. And it repeats itself again and again and again. And that can become a farce. Because we should know that if we're political actors, if we have choice, if we have agency, we should better change history so it's not so bad as it was back in the 13th to the 18th to the 19th centuries, right? It doesn't get any better. It becomes sort of tragic and farcical. So anyway, I decided, look, I don't have to be shy about being politically correct. All you have to do is look at the adverts that come from the Liberal Party to people to collect money for them. I think Blair's familiar with this one. My sister got this advert. So, I mean, as scholars and jesters, we have to be cynical and hard-nosed about everything. So if you look at this advert that came to get people to raise money for Justin Trudeau. How could you be anything but a magical realist? If you have, and I forget her name, I don't spend enough time in Canada, but I think she's a pretty popular singer, and she's got companion of the Canadian Order.
Chantal Crevillac.
Maybe her name's at the end, you might see it. Anyway, you have to be tuned into popular culture, right? So, you know, you have this, please give us some money, because December 31st is coming up, time to get your tax rebates. Explaining what a fantastic leader this is. It's new age, it's bad grammar, it's kids, it's love, you know, someone who also juggles a demanding career. I know that this doesn't come easily. It takes hard work. He's a phenomenal example. He's no exception to these hard-working lives. He sets the bar so high as to express his values not just in front of his own community, but in front of the world. That's a long, 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 complicated sentence. I don't know if she wrote it or not. There's just this fluff. We need a bridge builder, someone who's not caught up in negativity. It's got to be positive thinking, but dedicated to progress. Sensible outlook on the future for our children. We need someone we can look up to. So I'm not being too shy about being critical about any politics anywhere. You know, if you have this sort of discourse coming out of an advanced capitalist country, I don't know what to say. There's her name, Chantal Crevillac. Now, back to Zimbabwe. What happened to this dream? And tomorrow's lecture will be a bit more about the dream of a liberal solution to Africa's problems. The dream started to happen with the end of the Cold War. Democracy light, as John Saw would put it, would come in. We'd have multi-party elections. We'd get rid of all these dictators. Didn't have to worry about the Cold War. We could actually allow, this is a Western discourse, very full of hubris, full of confidence, full of racism almost. We don't have to deal with these dictators anymore, because now if people vote, they won't vote for these nasty communists, right? So post-Cold War, peace dividend. And structural adjustment policies, of course, in the 80s. Now Zimbabwe managed to avoid some of that structural adjustment stuff in the 1980s, and a bit of the pushing the democratic plate on everybody's throat until late in the 1990s. But certainly by 2000, with the economic crisis due to structural adjustment programs, due to the land invasions from 97 up to 2000, February 2000, and a new party on the block, right? Trade union-based party, the MDC and so on. Everybody, left-wingers, liberals, thought it was time for Mugabe to go, right? The empire had lost its clothes. 1999, Zapiro, the famous cartoonist from the Mail and Guardian and other papers in South Africa, didn't think there was too much time left for Robert Mugabe. But 2013, 2014, still there, right? So this dream of liberal democracy started out in February 1999, I guess, when the MDC began with the Workers' and People's Convention. Early February '99, officially started on another September 11. The idea that a trade union-based political party could become liberal has probably failed by now, for a whole bunch of reasons. Celebrations with the MDC, Nelson Chamisa, Tendai Biti, the new young generation of politicians coming in here, along with a trade unionist like Morgan Shankarai in the previous picture. Flashy campaigns, right from 2000 till now. But they're, at the end of the day, middle of 2013, a massive failure. ZANU-PF 62 to 34% for the presidential race, and in Parliament, ZANU-PF 77 to 34% higher in Parliament. and people trying to explain this. Well, one explanation, Palenza Mchia, a very bright young student activist who now has a PhD, there he is, he was beaten up as a student, now has a PhD, was writing this when he was in Oxford after the election. He said he kind of blames it on the MDC, and he puts a lot of blame on Nelson Chamisa, who was the organizer for that election. Didn't bother to register too many votes. Maybe this is the discourse that explains why the MDC lost. Too much belief that that guy up there was going to help them through. Not too many votes registered, kind of relying on those public rallies, but losing track fairly quickly. So a magical realist could kind of say, well, there's this spiritualism that comes up when the real world is failing. How is it that these guys can have such important positions and really think that God will win the election for them? So we get this massive victory. I think it was a combination of poor organization by the NBC, lots of trickery, the usual sort of stuff. People talked a lot about Nikuv, the Israeli election managing company that comes into a lot of countries in La Tiers-Monde and helps them win elections. So there were all sorts of stories about these computers generating 1 million extra votes and so on. That'll never be resolved. So I started to think there's something really, really funny going on here. And of course, one of the brightest politicians in Zimbabwe is Tendai Biti. And he likes to quote from magical realists quite a bit. From Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who kind of, when I studied Ngugi wa Thiong'o back in 1977 with Doug Killam, he was the Marxist Kenyan, and now he's kind of magical realism. So Tendai Biti's writing, even before 2013, in 2008, that we see nationalism as a discourse reach its highest stage of decomposition. We have to save nationalism from itself, or it will take the whole nation with it. And now, of course, with in the last few months, we've seen the shift in ZANU-PF, a clear emergence of a so-called faction with Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa, with the help of Dr. Grace Mugabe, who got the PhD in 3 months, winning the ZANU-PF Congress with hands down in December of last year. And the discourse around Grace Mugabe going around to public rallies was quite scary, because she sounded pretty tough. How do we account for this? How did ZANU-PF get through this liberal attack? Did Tony Blair help? Well, he probably did, because Tony Blair said, and I've had it verified by people who should know, he went to Thabo Mbeki once and he said, if we invaded Zimbabwe, would you guys help? Well, Mbeki said, no, of course. But of course, that message got around the rest of Africa, so that the liberal attempt to help democracy along could be labeled as an imperialist plot. So Tony Blair did his bit. And of course, Claire Short, back in 1997, when I think it was Kangai, who was Minister of Lands at the time, said, are you guys going to come to the party with a land reform assistance package? And Claire Short said, no, sorry, we're a new government, we're a new Labour, we don't deal with colonial problems, I'm from Northern Ireland, we've been there, done that, forget it. So, certainly the Labour Party in power in England throughout this whole period did its best, unthinkingly of course, to put Mugabe on a pedestal of anti-imperialism. And that helped, because other African leaders could say, this is quite silly, it's an imperialist plot, the MDC is the puppet of imperialists. And of course, the British and very many people helped the MDC extraordinarily. You'd see the people from the International Republican Institute hanging around all the rallies, and lots of stories about money coming from the British to the MDC. They hoped, like in Zambia, that a trade union-based party could beat the incumbents and then bring in a liberal economic regime. But of course, in the meantime, a lot of the land had been taken and was in the process of being fast-tracked. So it would have made a really, really tough reversal to privatize all of that land. You could do it. You could just make all that land individual tenure. That's probably why the World Bank was the only institution to actually sign off at a big land conference in 1998. They actually did put $50 million on the table for some pilot projects for privatization of land. But as of yet, tenure has not been privatized in Zimbabwe for the land that has been resettled. So sure, with a stroke of a pen, you could have the beginning of a process of primitive accumulation. Peasants get their own land, right? They become petty commodity producers, right? They can buy and sell land, they can get loans, right? And the process could begin by which some peasants lose, they sell out, some peasants get big, you have commercial farms come in, now you have lots of contract farming going on. So at one level, this retaking of the land into largely black African hands, and it's not all just the cronies, maybe 6,000 of the middle level estates have gone to cronies, but you're talking about 150 to 180,000 families who have got plots of land without tenure. All you'd have to do is give them tenure, and you'd have a system of private capitalism, a peasant utopia, emerging very quickly. And of course, we do have a lot of the peasant utopian agrarian sociologists around who would like this to happen, but they hesitate. When they start talking about what kind of tenure would be best, they say, no, we need something that's democratically articulated, and the state can take it away if you're not being a good farmer and environmentally sound, and all those sorts of things. So you get a lot of the people like Ian Scoons, who I think I'll show a picture of later, who really have a tough time dealing with the future of tenure relations in Zimbabwe. I'm jumping a bit ahead. Was it Maggie Thatcher who helped Mugabe along? Not just Tony Blair. This is what's fun about going to archives. So sometimes I'm a historian. I have this fantastic document in 3 weeks after the election, middle of May 1980, 3 weeks after Independence Day, April 17th, you have this meeting with Robert Mugabe and Maggie Thatcher. Maggie Thatcher is famous for saying, a terrorist remains a terrorist until he becomes in charge of a state. Then that person becomes a statesman. You know, it's realpolitik. Menachem Begin was a terrorist, becomes prime minister, and so on. So Mugabe, all of a sudden, after being a Marxist-Leninist, Roman Catholic terrorist, is a statesman. And he's meeting Maggie Thatcher here in 1980, and he's just laying out all of the problems he has with the opposition party, ZAPU, led by Joshua Nkomo. He's saying to her, these guys have been responsible for a number of very silly acts, some involving deaths. Those responsible have been arrested. They are going to develop a political project, force chaos on our country, and force elections. This is what they're up to. So you can sort of see Maggie sitting there, oh yeah, well this is interesting. ZAPU is close to the ANC, is close to the SACP, is run by the Soviet Union. We're going to support Robert Mugabe come hell or high water, which is precisely what she did throughout the 1980s. So you get that whole Cold War sort of beginning to international relations in the middle of the state. And here, a couple of years later, you have this discourse going on in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. What to do? Why should we keep supporting Zimbabwe in spite of the fact that we have Gakura Hundi going on? If we refuse military sales, and of course they like to sell Hunter jets to Zimbabwe as well, that was always a part of it, and it's clear in the archives that selling Hunter jets was very important to Maggie Thatcher. If we put too much pressure on Zimbabwe, that'll leave room for other countries to follow the example of Angola and Mozambique and accept large-scale military help from the Soviet Union and Cuba. Even though Mugabe is not really interested in going that way, he might. Especially the Americans are worried about this, so let's just play it cool. So you get that sort of, and it was also the same in the DRC as well. Mobutu was kept happy by the Americans because of his politics vis-a-vis Angola. When the next politician came in, Kabila, he kind of thought he could play Cold War games. So you get that in that pattern of international relations which sets up a supportive sort of structure. Or was it someone like this I managed to track down through the archives? Dennis Crennan, who was a British spy, working for Harold Wilson and Margaret Thatcher and everybody. He was a real working class Labour Party guy, hated the Soviet Union, but was deeply, deeply emotionally in favor of nationalism in Africa, because he'd met people like Nyeri. He knew Joan Wicken very well, who was Nyeri's personal secretary. Every letter you see to deal with the Zimbabwean Rhodesian crisis in the 1970s that goes through Dar es Salaam has Joan Wicken CC'd on it. And she was kind of an Oxfam type nun who was basically Nyeri's personal secretary. Anyway, these people were very close. Dennis Crennan himself was very close to Sarah Mugabe and actually looked after her for 3 years when she was in exile in London. Because when Robert Mugabe was put in prison in Salisbury in 1964-65 after UDI, Dennis Crennan, who was one of Kawunda's many assistants, went down to jail and said, "How can I help you?" And Robert Mugabe said, "Please, could you look after Sarah Mugabe?" So he did for 3 years. And Dennis, in interviews with me, has said she was the best diplomat that the Zimbabweans ever had in Europe. Or was it Stephen Joshua Solars? Some of the older people here will remember him as the head of the African Affairs Subcommittee in the Congress. In 1976, he went to visit Robert Mugabe when he was under protection or under house arrest, however you want to put it, in 1976, in Mozambique, when he was kind of waiting to see the lay of the land, how he could get the acceptance of the guerrilla soldiers after the whole mess in Zanu when Chitepo was assassinated in March 1975. So there was a real vacuum there. Robert Mugabe had to get into it. Mozambicans didn't know what to do with him, really. They put him in this house in Kolomani. How did Stephen Solars get there? I'm just looking now at the British archives who are assessing Solars's trip, but I haven't gone through all of that stuff yet. But he writes his letter after this meeting with Mugabe while he was under some sort of house arrest or protection in Kolomani, that this is one of the smartest politicians you're ever going to meet in Africa. Doesn't like the military type of rule that Mozambique has, doesn't want foreign intervention, in other words, wants to keep the Soviets out and Cuba out, and he kind of says, "You Americans, it's time for you to take a big role here. The British haven't done their job very well." Henry Kissinger's, meanwhile, is trying to get a big conference going to have a solution to the war. He also explains, and this is a big question here, nobody really knew who among the political leaders controlled the guerrilla soldiers. They were on their own, they'd formed a radical group, and they were challenging these old politicians. Mugabe tells Solars he has total control. The third force is not a united army between the two armies. ZAPU is out to lunch. Deal with me. So Solars sends this telegram back to the States. I interviewed some people in the State Department, and they said, well, Solars was just a politician. He didn't influence us. But I think he did. People were really by the end of, by the middle of '76, were really seeing Mugabe as the guy who was going to come out on top. Who else helped him? Well, of course, Thabo Mbeki helped him by going slow, by doing the quiet diplomacy, and so on. So, and we have this election in 2013, which was just a masterful blend of bits of intimidation, reminders of what happened in 2008 when there was a really, really violent second run in the election, MDC not doing their job properly, and so on. So, why did I turn to this funny literary concept of magical realism? Well, as so happens as we look for ways to explain things theoretically, it's kind of serendipitous. You know, some of us went to university when the places were run by Marxists. So, you know, being petty bourgeois kids, we'll go anywhere, right? So we want to get good marks, so we write good papers for our Marxist professors. So we become Marxists for a little while. You know, a good book on that is well, David Lodge. Every academic should read David Lodge. John Saul, my supervisor, taught in Maputo for a long time, and he taught in the Department of Historical and Dialectical Materialism, but all his students said, yeah, this is hysterical and diabolical materialism. So it could have been kind of an end-of-life crisis. Four really important Zimbabweans to me died in the past little while. And I'm in the midst of writing an article on Lionel Cliff now for his memorial edition in the Review of African Political Economy. He started out analyzing post-independence Zimbabwe with this line back in 1981 in Colin Stoneman's book. At such critical moments, in other words, during a war or at independence, or I guess what the Thatcherites used to call the honeymoon period when the new regime got into power. At such critical moments, and again, he's you know, as a Marxist, he's trying to balance structural determinism with agency, right? So he's saying at such critical moments, a war, an independence period, the balance of political forces is not simply an outgrowth of the broader social forces, but becomes determinant in itself. Politics takes charge. The challenge is to separate the factional squabbles with little social significance, what John Saul would have called wasteful petty bourgeois struggles. How to separate them from other struggles whose resolution could change the whole character of society. So you get someone like Lionel who's deeply interested in peasant revolution, peasant struggles, trying to get structure and agency blended here, and he looks back through the many factional struggles in ZANU-PF and ZAPU during the 60s and 70s to try and see, well, which ones were important, which ones could take the political torch and go ahead and make meaningful changes to get away from a society that's based on cheap labor and reserves and so on. How could we do that? Well, for Lionel and many other people who've been to Dar es Salaam and Zambia and so on, Lionel was teaching at University of Zambia in 74 till 76. When Herbert Tateva was killed, he ended up in jail with the guys who were accused of killing the national chairman of ZANU. And this young group of young Turks came out of that whole mess trying to start a new form of struggle. Anyway, he died too. So one of my heroes died in last year, who'd sort of come back to political life in 2000 after living in exile and working in beer factories and food factories and so on as an industrial chemist. Came back to political life in 2000. He was in his mid-20s at the time. He was leading this challenge to the old guy. People like Lionel and John Saul and so on would say, okay, well, there was this leftward moment in the 70s which could have taken things ahead, except they were swept to the side in 1977, and they spent 1977 to 1980 in Mozambique's jails, while the old guard went along the normal sort of way of neo-colonialism according to the ideology of Lionel Cliff, except there was a group within the old guard who was one kind of foot in the left-wing camp and one kind of foot in the right-wing camp. And the left foot was in jail with Lionel Cliff. So he spent time in his 3 months in jail in Lusaka, helping the left-wing guys, at least he thought they were left-wing, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Discourse is pretty easy to pick up. Rugara Gumbo, Henry Hammett Zaripi, Togogara, Chimarenga, quite a few. He helped them write a political curriculum for the school that they were planning to set up in the liberation camps after they got out. They were going to call it the Chitepo College. So he was helping them write, helping them draft left-wing political education for the guerrilla soldiers. The Zambians didn't know that he was really good friends with ZANU people. The Zambians put him in jail for being the ostensible leader of a students' demonstration against Zambian foreign policy in Angola. Zambians didn't know that his university buddies were ZANU activists. So that's how Lionel Cliff's writing is, okay, well, we got these shifts, even with this so-called old guard. But in 1978, this so-called left wing of the old guard also got thrown out of the struggle and spent the rest of the liberation years in Mozambique's prisons. Ironically, the guy who was most associated, at least in the public Zimbabwean mind, with that left-wing faction of the old guard, Rugaro Gumbo, became very public in November and December when he started saying that the faction which eventually got to the vice presidency was doing it all wrong. So he was taken away from his job as information secretary of the ruling party and is now unemployed. And another good friend of mine died last year too, so this is again why I'm depressed and turning to magical realism, is a white guy who joined ZAPU and their intelligence service in London and so on, a white Rhodesian who joined the Communist Party, joined ZAPU, and then later on, when he went back to Zim in 1980, eventually started up the famous book cafe, which is where everybody cool, like Blair's nodding his head in. Yeah, the book cafe. You know, that was where books were discussed and comedians would come and the music was great and a real cultural icon also died. And of course Terry Ranger, who was a liberal nationalist and so influential. And his last book is writing about his days in Rhodesia, then Rhodesia in the late 50s and 60s before he was expelled for being a part of the nationalists. And you know, he got kind of angry later on. By 2004, he wrote this book, Patriotic History, and wrote this article, Patriotic History and the Way History is Misused by the Ruling Party and so on. But I think there's a lesson here for all intellectuals who get involved with political groups or social groups of any sort in the third world, is that when we're young, we're so caught up and so happy to be with, you know, a new force, a new world, that it's hard to distance yourself from that and become more skeptical and more analytical and more critical, which might have happened to Terry Ranger. I don't know. But what else happened? I found my partner, who's a political scientist in South Africa, but also managed some public opinion polls in Zimbabwe. Quite by accident, I found a fake interview with her in an online magazine called the Zimbabwean Guardian, which is apparently run by Professor Jonathan Moyle, who's the head of information in the Zimbabwean government. A complete fake interview, saying Professor Susan Boyson agreed after waiting for a while that she had conducted a second public opinion poll that predicted a 69% victory for ZANU-PF, and it even quotes Professor Boyson, with quote marks, email conversation, saying, yes, we couldn't, the American embassy which funded this public opinion poll told us not to publish the findings. We have gone to Morgan Tsvangirai to advise them to pull out of the election because they're going to get slaughtered. So, who did this? Why? Why would someone spend time concocting a fake interview with an academic in South Africa? And then it went on and on. Susan finally stopped answering the phone when these guys were calling from the Herald. So eventually her name was removed from these news stories But the line was still pushed out that the Americans had sponsored a poll which had said ZNU-PF was going to win by 69%. The day before the election, headlines in the Herald, Americans predict this huge victory. Why? I asked a friend of mine, why would they, you know, on the day before the election, make this on the public news, and it was on the news that night too, before the election. Why bother with this? And she said, well, it's basically for the observers. When the observers see that this is going to be a publicly accepted landslide, it'll make them accept the victory much easier. But I also got into this idea of magical realism from reading this book by Rory Pilosoff, The Unbearable Whiteness of Being, borrowing from Milan Kundera and that literature coming out of Eastern Europe, the magical realism coming out of Eastern Europe. He doesn't talk too much about Kundera in the book. It's an interesting book to look at the discourse of white farmers during minority rule and also during since the 1980s. And this guy, Ian Schoons, who's probably the most respected agrarian sociologist in studying the land reform process in Zimbabwe, did a review of the book and got the author all wrong. So I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. When political scientists and agrarian sociologists start getting the names of literary figures wrong, can their stats really be that good about the farms, the success of the farms, and so on? If you look closely at Schoon's material, especially in articles, more articles than that book, it really gets to be a pretty small group of farmers who are doing pretty well out of the reform. It's going to be a hard slog. And even more propagandistic, I guess, is Joe Hamlin's and his partner's books, Zimbabweans Take Back the Land, where it's almost like Adam Smith. I always get these two Smiths mixed up, him and Adam. You know, Adam Smith, the sort of original sin. If you're lazy, you're not going to be a farmer. If you work hard, you're going to be a success. And then Marx says, well, that's, you know, we've got to be a bit more historical about this. Well, if you read the stuff about the land reform now, it's like there was none of this tumultuous, violent process. It was all just sort of a natural unfolding of history. So then I sort of go through, you know, who set me on the Marxist path? John Saul, well, okay. Robert Cox, the Gramscian stuff on international political economy. Then into sort of hegemony and the World Bank. That's sort of the work I've been going. But then I've been getting more cynical, I guess, is the hard work of primitive accumulation. Can this hard classical Marxism blend with Gramscian studies in a developmental situation? I don't know the answer to that, but the thing that finally turned the coin for me was when I was leaving the Harare airport after the 2013 election to go to Lusaka. There's a nice little bookstore there that's got really good classical literature, and there was Carlos Fuentes, The Eagle's Throne, talking about Mexican politics from the 1920s until close to the time he wrote the book, I think 2006 or something, and he died soon after. You don't need to know anything about how to fix elections. Nothing's new. It was all done in Mexico in the 1920s with the PRI, except for the computers. And you want to learn Politics 101, Third World, Developmental Studies, whatever, read Carlos Fuentes, Eagle's Throne. Because he's pretty good at how politics works, and he's pretty good at getting that Latin American sensibility in there as well. And he was a diplomat. He knew what politics was all about. Finally, I'm getting back to good old Antonio Gramsci, which says we've got to distinguish between ideologies which grow out of structures and ideologies that are arbitrary, rationalistic, or willed. Now, this is where he's being a real structuralist, and I guess he spent most of his life fighting against his structuralism because he wanted to have a bit more political will there. Although he also said, in the East or in third world countries, civil society is gelatinous, very undeveloped, the state can be very powerful. But anyway, he's being a structuralist here. He's saying, what are these organic ideologies that grow out of a structure? If we try and forget about this organic link, it's going to be a mess. It's going to be arbitrary. They only create individual movements, polemics, and so on. Even though they're not completely useless, since they function like an error, which by contrasting with the truth demonstrates it. Now, this was all quoted in an article written soon after the election in 2013 by George Sharamba, who was the Secretary of Information, Permanent Secretary for Information in the ruling party, and he writes a column every week in the Herald, the Saturday Herald, under the name of Nathaniel Manhero. So he's telling us, borrowing from Gramsci, and I keep wondering, did he read something I wrote one day? Look, we won because these other ideologies don't fit. This liberal ideology that the NDC had doesn't work. Our ideology is what works. Chimurenga, liberation, Africanism, whatever. I could go back further and say whatever John Saul taught me as a PhD student that socialism might work. Forget it. I mean, if you talk to people from the Soviet Union who spent time in Africa, they say, no, we always told Samar Michel he could never be a Marxist. He was crazy, but he wanted to be a Marxist-Leninist. Wait until the forces of production, blah, 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 ready. So, kind of forgetting about the politics here and relying on ideology is what I think Drama was doing, because the MDC did fail at its politics, not necessarily its ideology. Didn't get enough people out. And ZANU-PF used its politics very, very, very carefully, right from the day of July 2008, to make sure that they wouldn't do that much violence again, because that would really alienate the rest of the world, and that they'd win at this game. So that sort of ideological discourse ignores politics too much. So maybe I shouldn't really be a magical realist. Gellner, good old Ernst Gellner, the anthropologist, right? He had a really good slam at these American liberals who think that their version of the Enlightenment can just walk all over the world and take everybody with it. Gellner's saying other social values, the long and violent struggles to get them aside, just are not in the realm of the imaginable to neoliberals, be they economic neoliberals or political neoliberals. The problem of politics for Gellner is how to escape from such non-liberal societies. This is a huge problem. You're not going to get it done with multi-party elections, with a global peace dividend, and so on. So at the end of the day, what kind of magical realism can we take away? The exhausted magical realism that Dr. O talks about. Magical realism expresses the exhaustion of meaningful choice for him. But for Frederick Jameson, it doesn't have to be like that. It can be an incisive mode of analysis for politics in the world's periphery, given that they are rooted in a type of historical raw material in which disjunction is structurally present. There's an overlap, of course, the articulation of modes of production. And we can work with that. We don't have to just think, well, because liberalism or socialism doesn't work, we don't have a future. And of course, people who study anthropology and history know this, but you know, political scientists are kind of stuck in this funny world. It doesn't have to be a cynical, despairing perspective, but enjoins us to join a conquest of new kinds of relationships with history. So I guess we have to get beyond this liberal dream, so it won't turn into an authoritarian nightmare, which is what I'm supposed to talk about tomorrow. Taking into effect, again back to Gramsci, that international relations are interesting because the international intertwines with internal relations, ideologies, politics, culture, to create new, unique, and historically concrete combinations. And of course, that's what hybridity and globalization is all about. And again, going back to Gramsci, this particular ideology, for instance, socialism, liberalism, communism, neoliberalism, is disseminated in less developed countries, impinging on the local interplay of combinations in interesting ways. So that's what keeps it all that's what keeps it interesting. I don't know where to go from here. But in reading Fei Chung's book about her memories of the War of Liberation, I thought there was a really interesting part. Much of this book is very critical of tradition and critical of traditional peasants. Saying that the peasants were much too aligned with the securocrats, the militaristic leaders who were quite violent and not very good at gender and all of that sort of stuff. But then she actually had a meeting with some spirit mediums, and they kept calling, because she a Chinese Zimbabwean who joined the liberation struggle from her time teaching at University of Zambia, and went to the camps in Mozambique after the Chatepo vacuum, and became head of education in the camps and then Minister of Education. And then when she got upset with the government for going into structural adjustment policies, she left and became Minister of Cooperatives, and then went to UNESCO and so on. And now she's an educational consultant in Southern Africa, spends a lot of time in Namibia. Anyway, these spirit mediums kept asking her to come to one of their camps, because the spirit mediums were invited into the camps by many of the soldiers to, give a religious hand to the process. So she'd been receiving this message for days and days and days, and she was quite nervous about accepting the invitation, as she didn't speak very good Shona. She didn't think she had much in common with the leaders of traditional religion. She didn't know what to say to them, but they got messages and messages and messages. She walked for about an hour and finally got there with an interpreter. So she said her discussion with traditional religious leaders was very different from what she'd expected. They were asking her what was the Soviet Union doing involved in this struggle, what was China all about, what was the United States all about, why were they helping us. They had a really, really interesting discussion on international politics. And then she realized that there was serious antagonism between the spirit mediums and Tongogara, the famous leader of the army, who Fei Chung really doesn't think too much of. He was quite violent, raping lots of women, and so on. Whereas Fei Chung's best friend, Sister Janice McLaughlin, an American Maryknoll nun who spent time in the camps, thought Tongogara was the greatest guy since sliced bread. So you have a lot of different opinions about Josiah Tongogara. Anyway, the spirit leaders were constantly condemning unnecessary killing as well as sexual promiscuity. And though as far as they didn't specify names, the frequent statements made in trances, they say it's not us speaking. We're in a trance, it's the spirit speaking, so it's not us. Don't take it out on us. But we will condemn, we will chastise people who are doing things wrong. So in 1978, apparently Tongogara threatened the traditional religious leaders with imprisonment if they continued with their subversive allegations. He made the religious leaders stand up one by one in front of a crowd of thousands of people and subjected them to a verbal tirade. These white-bearded old men, dressed in the traditional black togas and without shoes, stood in silence. They did not deign to respond. 2 years ago, just a few months before independence, Tongogara died in a car accident. The adherents of traditional religion believed that this was the spirit's response. So, you can dig back into tradition and find some interesting things there. And this is kind of ironically what the Zipa, like I showed you the picture of Zeno Mashingara, the leader of this young Marxist group in the late 1970s. Historical materialist, dialectical materialism, scientific socialism. But as he grew older, he knew that the way to get support for an opposition, and he wasn't an MDC, but he wasn't ZANU-PF, was to talk seriously with traditional leaders. And then that's one thing all the donors neglected to do. They were pushing an urban liberal revolution. They said, no, don't go to the rural areas, these are just country folk. But there's something dialogical and dialectical, I think, that can happen out of a more grained approach to looking at how these systems of thought and belief and politics interact in places like Zimbabwe. So, sorry for going on a bit too long. do you take the chair now?
Yeah, I think we open up for Q&A. Thanks very much, David. Please, when you ask a question, if you can identify yourself. David knows some of you, but not everyone. It's nice to see where you're coming from. Any questions? Dominique?
I'm Denise Marshall. I teach in history. About 15 years ago, I was for a year at SOAS, and they invited Lyndall Roper, who is a historian of witchcraft in the Middle Ages, to talk to them. And what they said as an introduction was very much like you were saying, but it was not the magical realism of East Europeans, or they had turned towards people who were studying witchcraft in the Middle Ages. And she's done very interesting stuff on witch trials and how the so-called witches talked to the judges, and they thought that there, in the way that she was doing this, were ways of understanding society and politics in their respective places they were studying in Africa.
Do you collect, or do we? You started off.
Yeah, you could respond. Are there other questions?
Everybody else is catching their breath. They need a beer.
Yeah.
When I first came to Carleton in 1974, 75, that's where we always went after classes. No questions, right down to the pub. Yes. And there are lots of good anthropologists looking at Zimbabwe who do that. I haven't read enough of them. Not Peter Garlick. He was at University of Adelaide. So there's a rich set of materials there. And the question is, I guess, is because at the same time as there's that layer, there are 20 other layers of discourses which are either in all of those people's heads and actions, or in different levels of society, in different intensities of different discourses. So you get quite a hybrid collection. Which one becomes most important at a particular moment in time, or a particular place, or when young guys come in from the militia and start harassing people? What power do spirit mediums have still in that community? I haven't looked enough at that material. Blair probably knows it much better than I do. Blair, you should answer that question. And also, of course, when we look at history in other contexts and other times, then we get stuck into this teleological thing. Well, is Africa just going through the same process that the Western world went through 300, 400 years ago? So I think one is stuck between movement, regression, stuff I have read in Tanzania about during economic structuralism times, when times were getting really, really bad for people. There was an increase in incidents of witchcraft and murders for all of that sort of stuff. So, and I mean, that's not new. I think, what was it, good old Eric Hobsbawm saying at the times of crisis, there's more suicides, more mental illness, all of that sort of stuff. So in times of real economic and political crisis, probably the negative side of those processes gets exaggerated. I don't know, that's a guess. Fei Chung was saying how in a lot of the new farms, with this new wealth, relatively speaking, that the new peasants had, you had a regression to old marriage patterns where men were having more wives because there was more labor with more wives. And back to that sort of the Jeff Guy sort of history of gender relations and both erupt and all of this stuff. Women and children are labor. So you have more women and children, you get more land, right? So that process, you could perhaps be seeing that progress, that process going on. In a sense, I guess the old way of some of the earlier stuff I've written, just touching on it, is primitive accumulation with a racial twist. And Rob Davies, an economist in Zimbabwe, said, well, no, this is garbage, David. We did have primitive accumulation when the settlers came in and threw all those people off their land and proletarianized them, or else threw them back in to stay in the reserves. But with the racial twist, and race is huge, I mean, it's massive in that part of the world. It becomes a longer process of primitive accumulation through peasantization for the majority of the population instead. And the industrial working class has been wiped out, pretty much. So we're not even talking about proletarians anymore, whereas we did in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. Is an informalization of the urban economy. And I don't know, well, spiritually, there's all sorts of religious Pentecostals and so on with that. So a deindustrialization, informalization of urban environments and a peasantization of the rural environment, what sort of cultural and ideological permutations come out of that? And how do they work out politically? I don't think any, the opposition forces are crumbled, the MDC's in pieces. The younger generation from the universities, I think, is pretty much liberal. So there has to be a lot more thinking around those questions. So it's a good point.
I'm Robert, and you touched on this a little, but you were talking about the land reform and what's the general consensus on it. But I would like you to just explain a little more. What's the general consensus on the land reform? Was it beneficial to ordinary Zimbabweans, or was it just for Mugabe and his cronies, the current people?
Whose general consensus would you like?
Well, I guess in your opinion,
in my
you did like
feel.
something.
Well, I think there's been as Brian Raptopoulos has put it ever since the mid 2000s. He says there's this huge gap between the human rights discourse and the political economy discourse. The political economy discourse, the left-wing radical political economists have all gone to the land as the economy type of idea. Sam Moyo, people like that in Zimbabwe. And the human rights people have become linked, with the liberal NGOs, the MDC, urban opposition, donor funding, and they pretty much ignore what has been happening on the land. So you've got two languages, two nations. It's a bit like Canada, one French and one English. One's land and one's human rights. And a lot of the human rights people haven't really looked at the land. They say, oh yeah, all the land went to these cronies. And the land people have sort of tended to definitely have the human rights issues take a back seat. They say, well, we don't deny violence, but there's real democracy coming now because a majority of people, or a lot of people, have access to the land. Schoons, the picture I showed there with his book, The Land Reform Issue, they are still doing really serious work, and there's Prosper Matondi, and there's a huge number of Zimbabwean scholars who are doing really, really interesting work on the post-fast-track land reform moment. Some of them are really into private tenure is the only way to go, that's Prosper Matondi, and others are waffling. Like if you look at Ian Schoon's blog, he goes through page after page after page after how we can set up a nice form of tenure that is not too private but not too much state, but he's got a lot of technocratic faith in the state to do the right thing with the land at the end of the day. So there's a bit of magical realism there, I think. And his material that he's published in journals really looks at the differentiation, especially in his area is Mashingo. And Mashingo is quite different from the rest of the areas. Palanza and Chia has done work in Chipinge area in the east, right? Totally different processes of taking the land and what's happened afterwards with the land. So the dynamics are different. Of course, in Matabele land, dry areas is going to be much different too. So a lot depends on the soil types, the way in which the land was taken and the power dynamics that were set up there between the warlords and farmers in some
So
cases.
you're mentioning some statistics.
Yeah.
Are those, I think you say something like
Yes.
600,000
No, about maybe about 6,000 people got what is it A1 or A2? There's two categories, A1,
Yeah.
A2. About 6,000 got decent chunks. That would include a few with huge chunks. Anywhere from 150 to 175,000 units, including families, would have got the smaller, 6 hectares bits. With that, the tenure is not private, right? Okay. So it's not this capitalist land revolution. It's well, what is it? State, feudal, communalistic, and of course things haven't really changed in the communal areas, right? Although some people from the communal areas, of course, have gone to take farms in other areas for the land reform. So you still have the sort of communal system in the communal areas, and this kind of semi-peasant, small commodity producing zone, which is just, taking off. And of course, and what Skoons's articles in the journals show is, about a third who in his language are doing pretty well. Although that's a pretty precarious existence. If you have a drought, a bad season, can't get loans to buy seeds or something, it's going to be pretty rough. And of course you have lots of contractors coming in, right? So a lot of the tobacco, which has been a big, there's been a lot of tobacco produced recently, a lot of it going to China. A lot of that doesn't go to the auctions anymore. So those big auction barns where we used to have the buyers bidding for tobacco, and if it's good, it goes up in price and so on. They're not being used nearly as much as they used to. A lot of it will be contract farming, which means I make a deal with you, you're going to sell your tobacco to me at this set price, and if you can't produce it for less than that, you lose, I win, right? So a lot of more contract farming going on. But you probably ask Blair more about that than I. So the consensus is, I think it still depends. It's still very much a political thing. What side of the political fence do you stand on? If you like liberals and human rights people, you're going to say that this thing was a mess. If you're most white farmers whose land was taken don't think it was a great idea. There was this case, at the end of the day, I suppose these things either get resolved by use of force or the law. So there was this case that went to the South African Development Community Tribunal. And it was finally, and talk about donors, the donors paid an awful lot of money to those very, very expensive lawyers to win this case. I forget his name right now, but I can see him now. He was screaming at me for showing a film, and for letting a war veteran speak at a film. Jeremy Gauntlet, one of the most high-paid lawyers in South Africa, took the case to the SADC tribunal about one white farm that was taken, and it was deemed by the tribunal to be illegal based on racial bill of rights. But the SADC tribunal was then dissolved, it disappeared. But yeah, I can remember that lawyer who came to a film screening, and I had a war veteran. Being a good academic, I want to have both sides, right? So I had this war veteran saying it was great that we took this land, and I had another war veteran saying, no, it wasn't. And the war veteran talked for far too long, and this lawyer guy came up to me and said, shut that guy up! Academic freedom has gone too far. So people aren't talking to each other on this issue. They'll have to start talking pretty soon, because we're going to see a long time of ZPF.
Maybe we have a few other. I think Barbara, did someone else have their hand? Yeah, Enrico.
Oh, I'm Enrico. I'm from Angola. I grew up in a moment that we had to learn Marx, Lenin, whatever, because we had two sides, you know. In the north we have in the government we have the MPLA in the government, and in the other side we had UNITA, you know, the guerrilla who fought against the MPLA to get the power. But the people who used to live in the cities has to learn, had to learn this knowledge of Marxism and Leninism, and we had to know everything about this knowledge. So, and we learned that everything is, they said the country is of people is the country, people is the government, and all of things that we have, it's for everybody, you know. My land is not mine. My land is for you, for everyone here. So, but when we got the peace, it changed. It changed. So, all lands, it's you find that all lands in the country is in the government hands, in the ministries, generals, whatever. So, and how to say which politic is it? It's, as we said, like state land, or how to deal with this situation currently, because you said earlier that there were some agreements between Angola, Congo, with Mobutu, in Mugabe and the other, Kenneth Kaunda, in terms of putting in these countries, the freedom to the people, giving lands to the people, so that people can live better. But today it's totally different. How to deal with this situation? Sometimes it's put me despondent.
Well, yeah. When you say that since the peace, since Savimbi was dealt with,
Killed,
are you talking about the land becoming privatized?
Yes.
Yeah,
Now.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Right.
And in the past, you had much more. You had state farms, collective farms, peasantry. I mean, it seems in Mozambique after '75, the question how to deal with land. State farms didn't work too well. Now many farms are leased to big corporations. What's happening at the level of the peasantry, I'm not sure. It is a massive question, and it's the hub of the question of the first form of accumulation, to me. It combined with the formation of a proletariat which doesn't have access to that land. It's either thrown off the land or it's been bought off the land, So that creates a landless proletariat. But without industrialization, that landless proletariat just becomes an informal sector in the cities, and it's not very prosperous either. So it's the big question: how to deal with land in African societies, where in South Africa, 65% is in the commercial sector and 65% of people are urban. But in places like deeper Africa, you're talking about 95% of the land where it's informal tenure, non-registered. So even, so the chief or the king's relationship to that land is uncertain. You have people like Chimowu and Phil Woodhouse, who have done incredible studies on this. And basically what they say, we're talking about a vernacular forms of tenure. We're seeing all sorts of ownership systems evolve here, but they're not registered in the the city office with the deeds. It's a blend of chiefs, customary law, tradition, and all sorts of new traditions that are coming up very quickly with huge amounts of money. And the land grabs, massive across Africa. There must be somebody at Carleton who's studying land grabs. And often that'll just be land that some former director of the CIA waltzes into the Sudan and finds a chief who lives beside the Nile, and signs a lease for this land for 99 years, and then you have green beans for Waitrose in London or something, you know. Ethanol production from sugar, from maize, is all of these big land grabs. So it's an incredible question, and I think also with Africa, with these incredible rates of growth, although maybe with the commodity boom failing, that's also going to go into a tailspin. But what happens, you know, when that elite and the relationship to land? And Angola, of course, is one of the best examples, where you've had that oil money through the state, privatization.
Yeah.
So I don't know enough about Angola to know what's happening. What's the ratio of people in the cities to the people in the country? What happens in where UNITA was popular? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But it's the question.
Yeah. The point is that the people notice that all lands it's in the hand of some, guys, elite guys, general industry, whatever, and then they don't have nothing to do, so they are going to the big cities, in Luanda, Wamba, whatever, so they don't have more land anymore.
Exactly. And in South Africa, where you have many farmers whose workers are still in the same basic system as it was during apartheid, but there were rights with that system. You'd have burial rights on your land. You'd have rights to food and things like that. And then when the government comes in and says, well, let's have a minimum wage for these workers, well, the farmer says, okay, have a minimum wage, but you're going to have to rent a house from us, you're going to have to pay us more fees, no more easy credit at our little shop. And you also, of course, in South Africa have the huge influx of the people you're talking about, who lose access to their land in wherever, and they flood into South Africa, which is the Mecca, the capitalist dream of Africa, and become cheap labor, right? Anywhere from Bangladeshis who come up to set up shops in the townships, to waiters, to farm workers. I was at the launch of the latest Socialist Register in Toronto last week, and David McNally just talking about this on a global level. Global migrant labor in Canada, in North America, in Europe. This whole massive population of people you're talking about around the world who live this extremely precarious life. So this is a reserve army of labor that Marx was talking about. If development is about performing this task of original capitalist accumulation, if it can do it a little bit more nicely than it was done in Europe 500 years ago or whatever, that would be progress to me, because it's an incredibly different thing to do. It's like Gelner was saying, it is the historical question, is this transformation from something into a form of capitalism, So it's not a very happy answer, but that's why I'm going into magic next.
Man here and then Barbara after.
I'll ask a follow-up question first to this guy about school's work. You mentioned that about 2/3 of the people who are working or farming
in farms
are not doing well.
Yeah.
Has there been any study, or does it cover his scope of work? Does it cover why?
Yes,
is it relative to us that the land was in the hands of the minority? Not doing well. Relative to what?
Relative to...
David, maybe we'll get all your questions,
okay, sure.
because we've got about 10 minutes for the room. So why don't you answer all your, pose all your questions, and then we'll get the rest of the questions, and then David, you can respond to them all, right? So.
And then the question is that you talk about the fact that...
Talk about that?
The fact that the British and the Americans were in Zimbabwe trying to, prevent them from aligning with the Soviets. I would like to know if there are other interests aside that.
Other interests, other foreign interests?
Yeah.
Okay.
Especially America, Britain.
Or South Africa.
Yeah. Question, Barbara?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something. You said that the farmers are not doing well after the land reform exercise. I just wanted to correct that. All things considered, they are actually doing well. We have a situation where previously, before the land redistribution, we had just a few farmers, 4,000 commercial white farmers, owning most of the arable land. And that has since changed, and that has definitely made a difference in the lives of ordinary Zimbabweans. This is something that is not acknowledged much out here, but it is a fact that there's been a big change. And I just also wanted to say that with the large-scale farms in Zimbabwe, the A1 and the A2, that is state land. They get 99-year leases. So, but all land in Zimbabwe is state land.
Yeah.
But for the large scale, they do get 99-year leases. And there's a point you mentioned in Fei Chung's book about women and children being labor force for the farms. That might have been the case in Zimbabwe in the 1950s, in the 1960s. But certainly that is not the case in Zimbabwe today. And I don't know when Fei Chung's book was published, but that is certainly incorrect to suggest that there's people are going back to marrying more women so they have labor to work on the land. That's ridiculous.
And any further questions for David? Yeah, please.
Thank you.
Master.
For me, just wanted to clarify also in terms of a couple of things that I have heard. I much appreciate this discussion, especially the survey. In 45 minutes, I don't think you could do any justice to cover all the issues in Zimbabwe. But coming to the land reform, the figures we have 300,000 households, they benefited from the land reform. I seem to have heard you say 100,000. It's 300,000. That is the information I have. And I want to say that the structure of our land, in fact, the settlement patterns, actually, part of it we owe to Canada. Somewhere along the line. First, we have the mission settlement in 1890, and as bad as it sounds, typically a horse would, or carriage would travel as far as it could. Wherever it stopped, that place is owned by the person who is there. Whoever white person then owns that place. And then the horses would move again, wherever they stop, that's another new settlement, another farm for the whoever is in there gets checked out. And in the 60s, I know that the Prime Minister sent a delegation to Canada to come and learn about the reservation system. And the apartheid in South Africa, the apartheid in Zimbabwe, it owes that structure to Canada, fortunately or unfortunately. But that is the way it is. That is a fact. And when people talk about Zimbabwe, they don't want to acknowledge that there was apartheid in Zimbabwe. It's amazing to us all, because we who have lived the life in Zimbabwe, we lived under apartheid. Except they sanitized and called it the dualized economy. That's the way they sanitized the word. It was called the dualized economy, but it was really just apartheid. And this you don't see. In fact, I've been here a few winters now, like I told you. It's very silent about apartheid in Zimbabwe. But the same people who were in Zimbabwe are the same people who were in South Africa. And they ring the bell about apartheid in South Africa. What about in Zimbabwe? But you know fully well, there's no secret there. So I think when you're educating people, I think it's fair to say, you know what? The structure in these two countries is very much similar. And the reason being, the reason they were set apart from the rest of Africa was because it was supposed to be a bastion for the white population. It was purely racist motives. And the racist motives did not take into account that they were There were people there. There were indigenous people there. So when you refer to indigenous people in Canada, we're talking about the people who have put in reservations. When you refer to indigenous people in Zimbabwe, we're talking about the majority of the population. So we're not, in other words, you can play with semantics. Right here, so many types of semantics. Heritage, this, visible, this, it's all stuff that I picked up here. So it's good to share this information. And I was interested when you talked about Colin Stoneman. Colin Stoneman.
Yes.
Colin Stoneman.
Yes.
Yes, because he did a study in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
And discovered the ownership pattern of capital. And I was there in Zimbabwe then, and I was working in the Ministry of Industry and Commerce. I was very familiar with that study. And that study did not at all help the new government. All it did was to confirm that something had to be done, just like the land. And I'm glad that you commented on the clear shot. What happens there, the Labour and the UK, the Labour and the Conservative, that transition there. I'm glad that you raised it, because a lot of people, when they're speaking about Zimbabwe, they would rather not refer to that part. So it is good that you raised it. Yeah, good job.
Great.
So that's a few points that I
Thank you, Ambassador. Do you have one more comment, and then we'll have to give you.
Yeah, just,
hopefully, no one needs this room. We'll find out.
Touched a bit on it, and this touched a bit on it as well. But I'm sure you've heard of the willing buyer, willing seller, which is what was recommended for most former colonies. But it's been proved that it hasn't worked in any of the countries that it was recommended. It simply doesn't work. So besides Zimbabwe, I think you said something as well about the law of force. Besides Zimbabwe, who's perhaps had to use force for land to shift hands, what's the it's unfortunate lives are to be lost in the process, but there has to be a better way for land redistribution, or what could happen.
Great. Let me just ask a question, take my last question, get you back to the title. So to understand, what the current dynamics in Zimbabwe, which is all within ZANU-PF, you mentioned the Majuru faction, they denied it factions, but Majuru and her allies being pushed out, and Mnangagwa in power, and Grace Mugabe, seems to be a new force within the party, which caught everyone by surprise, from my understanding. Should we be reading more Fuentes, or should we be reading Gramsci, or should we be looking at old Marx to understand those dynamics?
All of the above. Where were we? Schoons in the 2/3, yes. I think the latest I read from Schoons is he's sort of floating around 170,000 family units. But there's a lot of different data out there, and I'm not sure what's right. And yeah, you have the 99-year leases, and it's an administrative problem too. A lot of the leases aren't being produced, so people don't get the leases. So who then is in charge? That's an administrative problem. Maybe that's going to be fixed with, now that I think political problems are going to be finished for a long time. I think ZANU-PF is fairly secure in where it's going to go. I don't know, I guess would have more knowledge about it, whether Didymus Mutasa's constitutionalist feint is going to work or what, but I think it's going to be pretty secure. Sanctions are finished. It's going to be a re-engagement, I think, which is probably, given the way in which the magical realist liberalism idea hasn't really worked, is probably not a bad thing. And people are going to have to sit down and think, what about industrialization policies? Because no matter, if you got 300,000 or 170,000 units, there's a lot of other people. And to solve the problem, this big problem we're talking about, you do need state-led industrialization policies. You need to have protection from foreign competition. You need to have infant industry protection. And yeah, some of Colin's stuff and the stuff in the early 80s was really, because Zimbabwe used to be the second most industrialized per capita society in Africa. In spite of or because of the racial dynamics. Because one of the reasons was during the Liberation War there were sanctions against Rhodesia, so Rhodesia had to build a lot of things by themselves. So they didn't import all their razors from Taiwan. And you had fantastic mechanics who would fix up those old cars that were putting around, you know. As soon as you had opening up of the economy, as Thabo Mbeki wrote in this piece in 2001, where he was so critical of, and this was a piece that was circulated to the ANC in 2001 before the 2002 election, so critical of the Revolutionary Party. Basically, Mbeki was saying, you've got to do what the IMF wants. You guys have spent too much money on education, too much money on social services, you've drained the fiscus, you were bribing the people. Instead of having them become part of the revolution, you were giving them free healthcare. And Mbeki was a real Thatcherite in those days, right? As he was writing his proposal for NEPAD, he was chastising Robert Mugabe for having created a situation in which it was going to be very hard to get out of. It's a fascinating document. But again, if you're going to liberate the land, going to create a free marketed land, whether it's 99-year leases or private tenure, you're inevitably going to have some people are going to win, some people are going to lose. The losers go to the cities looking for jobs. If you don't have an industrial policy, there goes the next stage of your development. Now, what is the big question in Zim now? Indigenization or open up? And Chinamasa and the others, this is a huge debate that's going on, right? Ivo Mandaza has he's kind of an intellectual who brings these people together. Okay, open up foreign investment, or how do we create an internal bourgeoisie that is going to be developmental, rather than just a comprador or cronies or that sort of thing. Whether those debates get entangled in factions that are political, I guess that goes back to Lionel Cliff's issue. What are the factional squabbles that don't really have an impact on developmental policies, and what are the differences of opinions that do? And do they become political? That's, I think, the crucial question, because we're talking about kind of a Bonapartist type of system where, you know, class struggle is kind of at an impasse, so the state does have a lot of power. In the 70s, before structural adjustment in Africa, there was a lot of industrialization. There was a lot of growth. Structural adjustment, zoom, it finishes. So at the end of the day, we are talking about those kind of economic policies, which have, of course, political ramifications as well. So relative to the two-thirds, relative to, well, yes, if you had a job on a farm, on a white farm, and it was a third of the white farmers were okay, treated the workers fairly well. You were doing okay, that's gone. But I think what Schoons is doing is not relative to the past, but relative to a vulnerability. So if there's a drought, if there's a lack of credit, if there is an inflationary surge, if there's a bad crop, how are you going to fare? And they're saying that, you know, about two-thirds is going to be, it's pretty precarious. But he's also saying a lot of people are moving into different industries, butcheries, that sort of thing. So we're basically seeing the reinvention of a whole political economy. And that's never easy, right? Even if you do have a state supporting industry, because then of course you have problems with efficiency and so on. British and Cold War and other interests. Definitely South Africa had a big interest in Zimbabwe 1980 till 1990. And they were poking, they created this little super ZAPU dissident group, and they were doing two things at once. They were destabilizing the regime, but not destabilizing the regime so much so that it would leave it open for ZAPU, because ZAPU was linked to the ANC and linked to the South African Communist Party. So the South Africans were cooperating a little bit with the new regime in order to keep ZAPU and ANC from setting up another base, but also destabilizing by supporting the dissidents within. So there was a real interest here. Australia too is another model for apartheid. The Australians, the Canadians, Mahmoud Mamdani's book about subject and citizen, about different forms of indirect and direct rule. The models are, global history is full of them. Fei Chung, by the way, Fei Chung made her comment about the farmers in 2007, after she wrote the book. The book is 2006. She didn't say that in her book. She said it in a public event at Sape's meeting at the Mikos Hotel. So, but as you know, Fei Chung has, sometimes she's very, very anti-peasant and very critical, and other times, of course, quite favorable in her discussions of the Zimbabwean government, because she comes from that group in the 70s, and she was a very close friend of Lionel Cliff, which was somewhere left, right, old guard, new guard, and there's not many of that people, not very many of that group left, I guess, who are really, and that's another thing, magical. I mean, who talks about Marxism anymore? Just us old people, It's about, at least it's probably a pretty good way of analyzing things. So then we had the history. Well, yeah, certainly. I mean, what I really like studying most is what was going on in the War of Liberation with the different groups like Wilfred Mahanda's group, and clearly, land was the big thing. The second big thing was democracy, freedom. And as Mahanda would say, or Zeno Meshingura would say again and again, is we were fighting also, not just for the land, but also for freedom of expression, all the liberal verities. And in many ways, yeah, he was this old Marxist, but in many ways he became a liberal, as have many of the sort of dissidents. That's the wrong word to use, not dissidents. Oppositionists. So I don't, I guess my last quote here is basically saying that Gramsci was a magical realist. Because there is this flurry of ideologies and policies in every state. It's not just the third world. I mean, look at my first quotes from this woman speaking on behalf of Justin Trudeau. All politics is about magical realism. So I'm looking for a new discipline. History, anthropology. I teach development studies, so I can do anything. Just give me another. So thanks very much.